You think you know Sardinia. Sun-bleached coast, Italian passport, good pecorino, maybe a vague memory from a geography class about the second largest island in the Mediterranean. That's it. That's where most people stop. But here's the thing. That picture is so incomplete, it's almost embarrassing. And the reason it's incomplete has nothing to do with history books getting lazy. It has to do with something far older than any book. Something written in blood and bone, and the quiet accumulation of generations on one of the most genetically unusual pieces of land on Earth. Because when researchers began collecting DNA from modern Sardinians and comparing it to populations across Europe and beyond, something strange kept coming up. Something that didn't fit. Sardinians don't cluster with mainland Italians the way you'd expect. They don't cluster with Spanish populations, or Greek, or French. When you map their genetics against the rest of Europe, they sit apart, almost like a ghost population from a world that no longer exists anywhere else. And that's not poetic language. That is the actual pattern in the data. This island didn't just preserve culture, it preserved blood. So the question isn't really about Sardinia, the tourist destination. The question is about what Sardinia represents. A frozen window into a version of Europe that was almost entirely overwritten. A living record of people who were here before the continent became what we think it is. And by the time we're done, the word European is going to mean something completely different to you. Let's go in. Start with the island itself, because geography here isn't just backdrop, it's the engine of everything that follows. Sardinia sits in the western Mediterranean, roughly equidistant from the coasts of Italy, France, and North Africa. But that positioning is a little deceptive. Yes, it is surrounded by sea, but the interior of the island is something else entirely. A landscape of granite ridges, deep ravines, and high plateaus that made movement within the island itself surprisingly difficult. You have to imagine what that means over centuries. Not just isolation from the outside world, but micro-isolation within the island. Village communities in mountain valleys that stayed largely separate from other village communities just a ridge away. The sea was a wall, not a highway, at least for most of Sardinia's history. And walls, as it turns out, are extraordinarily effective genetic preservatives. Here's what nobody tells you in the standard story. Islands don't automatically produce genetic uniformity. What they can produce, under the right conditions, is a kind of layered freezing, where ancient patterns get locked in because the usual mechanisms of mixing, of conquest, of mass movement just don't reach with the same force they reach everywhere else. Sardinia is the extreme version of that phenomenon. The rugged interior in particular became a kind of genetic fortress, a place where communities lived and died, and reproduced in patterns close enough to closed that what came in stayed remarkably stable over vast stretches of time. Keep that in mind, because it matters later. Because we're going to ask why those patterns look specifically the way they do. And the answer is going to take us far further back than Rome, further back than Carthage, further back than the earliest civilizations most people have ever heard of. But first, let's explode one of the cleanest myths in popular European history. When most people think about the origins of Europeans, they imagine something relatively simple. Maybe a wave of prehistoric people spreading out across the continent. Maybe some mixing with Neanderthals, because everyone's heard that story now, and that's more or less it. The picture is clean. Europeans descend from Europeans. But that's not what the genetics shows. The actual pattern is layered in a way that most people have no idea about, and it involves a complete rewriting of the continent's population not once, but at minimum twice in the deep past, and possibly more. Here's the structure, roughly. The earliest modern humans in Europe were hunter-gatherers, people who lived off the land for tens of thousands of years. Then, starting around 8,000 years ago, something dramatic happened. A new group of people began moving out of what is now Anatolia, modern Turkey, and spreading westward into Europe, bringing with them an entirely new way of life: farming. These were the first farmers of Europe, and their expansion was not a gentle cultural exchange. It was a demographic replacement, a slow wave of agricultural communities washing over and largely displacing the hunter-gatherer populations that had lived in Europe for millennia. And the key thing about these early Anatolian farmers, the thing that connects directly to our story, is that Sardinian genetics today reflects their ancestry in unusually high proportions. This is what researchers mean when they describe Sardinia as a proxy for ancient European farmers. The signal is strong enough that in ancient DNA studies, when scientists want to understand what those Neolithic farming populations looked like genetically, they often use modern Sardinians as the closest living reference. Think about that for a second. People on this island today are walking around with an ancestry profile that resembles populations from 8,000 years ago. Populations that were largely replaced or heavily mixed everywhere else in Europe. That's extraordinary. But now we get to the twist, because those Anatolian farmers didn't have the last word either. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, at least if you have tidy ideas about European ancestry. Because roughly 5,000 years ago, give or take, a third population appeared. They came from the Eurasian steppe, the vast grasslands that stretch from Eastern Europe across into Central Asia, and they brought with them horses, wheels, a reconstructed language that linguists trace as the ancestor of most modern European languages, and a genetic signature so dominant that it reshaped the populations of almost the entire European continent. Researchers have described the scale of this migration as one of the most dramatic demographic events in European prehistory. The steppe ancestry flooded into Central Europe, into Northern Europe, into Iberia, into the British Isles. It swamped existing populations in ways that are still visible in the genetics of modern Europeans, from France to Poland to Ireland. Now watch what happens. Sardinia barely shows this signal. The steppe migration, the single biggest population turnover event in European prehistory, landed on the continent with the force of a wave and essentially broke around this one island. The genetic proportion of steppe-related ancestry in modern Sardinians is dramatically lower than in virtually any other European population. And this is the migration that missed one island. And it didn't miss by accident. The Mediterranean Sea, the internal terrain, the logistical difficulty of actually getting to Sardinia in meaningful numbers during the Bronze Age, all of it combined to shield the island from the full force of a demographic transformation that rewrote the DNA of a continent. So when researchers put Sardinian genetics on a European map, and the data points sit far away from everyone else, this is what that distance represents. It is not a quirk. It is a record. It is the accumulated result of a chain of barriers, water, mountain, distance, that preserved a genetic profile closer to Europe's farming founders than anywhere else on Earth. And that naturally raises the question, who exactly were the people living on Sardinia when all of this continental transformation was happening? This is where the Nuragic civilization comes in. And if you have never heard that word, you are not alone, which is exactly the problem. The Nuragic people built thousands of stone towers across Sardinia, starting roughly in the Bronze Age. Circular fortress towers called Nuragic, and there are estimates of several thousand of them still standing or partially intact across the island today. These were not simple structures. They were multi-story, architecturally sophisticated, built without mortar using precisely fitted stone blocks. And they represent a civilization that was active and complex at a time before Rome was a city, before Greek colonization had reached its full extent, at a time when much of what we think of as classical Mediterranean civilization was still centuries away. But here is what nobody tells you about the Nuragic people. They were not mysterious outsiders. The genetic evidence suggests they were largely continuous with the farming populations that came before them. descendants in the broad sense of those Anatolian-derived Neolithic farmers who had arrived on the island thousands of years earlier. The Nuragic civilization was not a new arrival. It was a local flowering, a development that emerged from a population that had already been on the island for a very long time, shaped by the island's specific demands, its resources, its terrain, its particular relationship with the sea. And then history, as it tends to do, started arriving with swords. The Phoenicians came first, establishing trading outposts on the coasts. Then Carthage extended its reach across the western Mediterranean, and Sardinia fell under Carthaginian control, valued for its agricultural production and its strategic position on the sea routes that connected the African coast to Iberia and to the broader Mediterranean world. Then Rome came, as Rome always did eventually, and by the 3rd century BCE, Sardinia had become a Roman province, one of the first outside of Italy proper. This is the historical hinge, the moment the story is usually told as straightforward conquest, as Sardinia becoming simply absorbed and Romanized and eventually Christianized and eventually Italian. But that's only the surface story, because here's the duality that runs under all of it. Sardinia was conquered repeatedly, by Carthage, by Rome, by the Vandals, by the Byzantines, by the Aragonese, and eventually incorporated into what became the Italian state. Every one of those conquests left marks, in language, in law, in religion, in architecture, but not, in any dramatic way, in DNA. You can occupy a place without replacing its people. That sentence sounds simple, but the genetics make it vivid. Each wave of political control brought administrators, soldiers, merchants, colonists, but not in numbers large enough, apparently, to fundamentally shift the underlying population structure that had been building on this island for thousands of years. The conquerors changed the language spoken in the markets. They changed who was taxed and to whom. They built their temples on top of older sacred sites. They did not rewrite the bloodline. And by the time researchers started doing large-scale genetic studies on Sardinian populations, the signal was astonishing, not just in the divergence from mainland Europe, but in the internal structure of the island itself, where some communities showed patterns consistent with remarkably high levels of endogamy, of people marrying within their own village or valley over many generations, producing a kind of genetic diversity that is actually reduced compared to broader populations. That's a specific and unusual pattern. It's the fingerprint of long isolation at a micro scale, of communities that were not just separated from the outside world, but, in some cases, separated from each other. Let's talk about what Sardinia was exporting before we talk about what that genetic isolation means in the big picture. Because there's a common assumption baked into how we discuss islands and backwaters that needs to go. The assumption is that isolation means marginality, that a place cut off from the main currents of history is therefore unimportant to those currents. Sardinia explodes that assumption in several different directions. Long before Rome made it a grain province, before the famous Sardinian grain that helped feed the city of Rome at its height, the island was already a node in a prehistoric trade network that stretched across the western Mediterranean. Obsidian, volcanic glass, one of the sharpest cutting materials available in the prehistoric world, was found on Sardinia. And obsidian from Sardinian sources has been found at archaeological sites spread across the broader region. This isn't marginal. This is a prehistoric export economy. People were coming to this island, or were trading with people who came to this island, for a resource they couldn't get anywhere else in the region. And that's before the copper, before the agricultural surplus that made Sardinia strategically invaluable to every empire that came its way. The empire's breadbasket nobody remembers. That phrase belongs here, because Sardinian grain flowing into Rome is not a minor footnote. It's a direct line between this island and the ability of one of history's largest cities to function. The empire wasn't doing Sardinia a favor by ruling it. The empire was extracting something essential from it. Now here's where the genetic detective work gets genuinely revelatory, and we should sit with this for a moment because the implications run in every direction at once. The basic finding is this: when you plot modern Sardinian DNA on a map of global genetic variation, the population sits closest to samples taken from ancient European skeletons, specifically skeletons from the Neolithic period, from the era of those early Anatolian-derived farmers, not close to modern mainland Europeans, close to ancient ones. Some ancient European skeletal remains, when their DNA is analyzed, produce a genetic profile that looks more like a modern Sardinian than like any other living population on Earth. That is the living fossil record point, and it's extraordinary on its face. But dig a little deeper, and the picture gets more complex. Genetic analyses have found that the maternal and paternal lineages, mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers, Y chromosome DNA passed through fathers, tell slightly different stories in Sardinia. This kind of divergence between maternal and paternal lines is a pattern researchers look for when they're trying to understand whether historical migrations were gender skewed, whether, for example, incoming populations were predominantly male in ways that affected which lineages got passed forward. The details of what exactly this means for Sardinian history specifically are still being worked through, and different studies weight the evidence differently. But the broader pattern is consistent with what we see in many populations that experienced waves of conquest or migration. The genetics of who stayed and who arrived are not uniformly distributed across gender lines. This is where the duality comes back with force. Sardinia was not perfectly sealed. Some outside ancestry did get in. The question has never been whether Sardinia was a hermetically closed system. It wasn't. But whether the outside influence was enough to fundamentally shift the underlying genetic profile inherited from those Neolithic farming ancestors. And the answer, consistently, across multiple large-scale analyses, is that it wasn't. The Sardinian genetic signal remains distinct enough from all other modern European populations that it continues to function, in academic research, as the best available proxy for what those ancient farmers looked like. That's a remarkable thing. That's thousands of years of history, conquest, colonization, trade, intermarriage, all of it, leaving a genetic record that is measurable and real, but not large enough to erase what came before. And that pattern, the DNA that didn't match the story being told on the surface, keeps pointing back to the same thing. The island held. Now widen the lens one more time, because this is where the Sardinian story stops being about one island and becomes about all of us. When ancient DNA research really got going, when researchers started pulling genetic material from prehistoric skeletons across Europe and comparing it to modern populations, one of the biggest revelations was just how many times Europe had been demographically remade. The hunter-gatherers who were in Europe first, the Anatolian farmers who largely replaced them, the steppe migrants who then largely replaced or heavily admixed with the farmers. 3 major population layers, at minimum, each one transforming the genetic landscape of the continent. Modern Europeans are, in various proportions, a blend of all 3, and the proportions vary enormously by geography and by specific local history. But here's the thing: we can only understand those proportions. We can only work backward to understand what those ancient populations look like, because we have reference points. Because we have populations that preserve, in unusually high concentration, the genetic signal of one of those founding layers. Sardinia is the most important such reference point for the ancient farmer ancestry. Without the Sardinian data, reconstructing the genetics of Neolithic Europe would be dramatically harder. The island isn't just a genetic curiosity. It is a key that unlocks the deeper history of an entire continent. And that reframes everything. The isolation that looked like marginality was actually preservation. The barriers, the sea, the mountains, the internal valleys that kept the big waves of continental migration from fully reaching the island were the same barriers that kept a biological record intact. A record that is now irreplaceable. So let's return to where we started. Sardinia. Sun, coast, Italian passport, maybe a vague memory from a geography class. The second largest island in the Mediterranean. A place on the periphery. That picture isn't just incomplete, it's almost perfectly backwards. Sardinia is not on the periphery of European history. It is, in a very literal genetic sense, closer to the origin of European history than almost anywhere else you can go. The people living there today carry ancestry that connects more directly to the founders of European farming civilization than any mainland population. The conquests that came, Phoenician, Carthaginian, Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, Aragonese, left their marks in the spoken language, in the place names, in the architecture, in the records. But the DNA held, not perfectly, not completely, not in some mythological, pure bloodline sense. That's not what the science shows, and that's not the point. The point is that the core signal, the deep ancestry that links modern Sardinians to those Neolithic farmers who walked into Europe from Anatolia 8,000 years ago, is still there, still legible, still strong enough that scientists today use it as a reference when they want to understand who those ancient people were. That is what isolation actually did here. Not stagnation, not backwardness. Preservation. A kind of accidental time capsule created by water and rock and the cumulative weight of generations that stayed. Every conqueror who came to Sardinia was extracting something: grain, metals, strategic position, taxes. What they were leaving behind, without knowing it, was a living record of a world that had already vanished everywhere else. And that's the universal point. The thing that makes this bigger than one island. Every population is a palimpsest. Layers written over layers. Each new wave of history adding its text, partially obscuring what was there before. Most populations have been overwritten so many times that the earliest layers are almost unreadable. Sardinia just erased less. The question for any origin story isn't, where did we start, in some clean, singular sense. It's, how many layers are there? How deep do they go? And what happens to the ones at the bottom when the pressure from above is relentless? Sometimes the pressure doesn't reach. Sometimes an island in the middle of the sea, rugged enough in its interior to protect its own communities from each other, becomes the one place where the oldest writing survives. And that tells us something, not just about Sardinians, but about the nature of identity and ancestry everywhere. The origin story is never clean, never simple, never what the schoolbook said, and it's always more interesting than the myth. So here's my question for you. Which ancient population do you think left the biggest genetic fingerprint on modern Europe? The original hunter-gatherers who were there first, the Anatolian farmers who reshaped the continent, or the steppe migrants who came later and left such a visible mark? Leave your answer in the comments, because honestly, the data here is fascinating, and I want to know what you think. And next time, we're going to look at the people who didn't make it. The populations who were in Europe's story, and then effectively weren't. The ones who got erased so completely that we only know they existed because an ancient skeleton turned up in the right place at the right time. That story is darker, stranger, and it rewrites the map in ways you're not going to expect.